Thanks, Marion. So welcome to the September 1st meeting of the Climate Council Science and Data Committee. I am your faithful co-chair, TJ Poor, with Jared Duvall's the other co-chair here. Thank you for coming. We have a pretty full agenda today. Once we get into the substance here, we'll just briefly update the committee on the presentation of the social cost of carbon report to the full Climate Council last week. And then we'll go over the greenhouse gas inventory review and the task group recommendation in the memo. I'll have an opportunity then for public comment. Built in a little time for a quick break this time and to maybe keep everybody a little more sane than usual. And then dive into cross-cutting systems task group and then monitoring and assessment strategy task group and some task group reports and committee discussion there. And a little bit of public comment again at the end of that discussion. Before I ask if there's any objections to the agenda, I do want to see if we should put on and the right time. I'm not positive because I don't know if we have everybody for this whole meeting of just our future subcommittee meetings and the timing of those. Now that it's the fall, I think there's a couple of conflicts that have developed and regular conflicts, and I'd like to just make sure that we can have a meeting time that the most people can make at the most times, if that makes sense. So and it seems like we may want to try and do that earlier rather than later. I know, Jay, you have to leave at 2:30 today. So, but at the same time, Leslie Ann isn't here yet, and she has a conflict in the early part of the meeting. So I am going to suggest, well, do folks have any objections to the agenda aside from kind of adding that piece on the schedule, or including adding that piece on the schedule? Okay, so I think the agenda looks okay to everybody, and I'll just point out, so I guess I'll just identify the conflicts that I know about now. So I know that Leslie Ann, it has a conflict till at least 2 o'clock, but a little after their teaching schedule. And then Jay, I think you have a conflict, it looks like, after 2:30 weekly, right? So these Wednesday afternoon slots, I'm not sure if they're going to continue to work. But I'm not sure that we're going to be able to find a good alternative time either. So I'm not sure if how we want to move forward and if other folks have suggestions.
Would it be possible just to identify some consistent blocks of time on certain days of the week and do a doodle poll so that we can get a sense of what works for the most people? I guess I'm open to being surprised that we could figure it out quickly all together here, but I feel like there's probably enough complexity that I wonder if it makes sense to just do a polling exercise between now and the next meeting and then list that as a agenda item for the next meeting. But in the meantime, we might want to see if we want to continue with that next meeting on September 8th or look to adapt it based on the results of that polling.
Doodle is your friend.
Yeah, thank you, Jared, for that suggestion, and Richard for the second. So we'll send out a poll with some morning, afternoon times, and then just generally, and then let people write in kind of any specific issues with like afternoon, morning, and then and try and find the best time. Okay, so again, the other piece of front matter are the minutes for August 18th that they were linked in the agenda. Does anybody have any objections to approving those minutes? Hearing no objection, let's consider those approved. And then we can dive right into the update on the social cost of carbon presentation. Jared, take it away.
Thanks, TJ. And I'm glad that David is here. And David, I'd invite you to kind of jump in or clarify if I speak to something that should be jumped in on or clarified. So I think for the main update for the full subcommittee is that there was a full climate council meeting on Monday, August 23rd, at which the recommendations, the one-page letter that this subcommittee came to consensus on that had been drafted by the social cost of carbon task group were presented. I shared those. There were some questions that came up in the discussion. Some counselors wanting to learn more about the social cost of carbon. Some counselors wanting to know more about the implications of the choices of different discount rates. There were also questions, again, related to this question of whether we're looking at a social cost of carbon, a social cost of carbon dioxide equivalent, or we're looking at the social costs of individual greenhouse gases kind of mapped out individually. And so there are, just for purposes of clarity, and I'll defer to David on this, but my understanding is that in lieu of that last subcommittee discussion and the discussion that happened at the council, there were a couple of things that were clarified in a final version of the white paper, which include that the appendix was updated to include not just that social cost of carbon dioxide sheet from the state of New York, but also listing as an appendix for reference the social costs of methane and nitrous oxide that New York had also developed, and then more kind of stating that it is an open question whether we are looking, that we will be looking for the guidance of the interagency working group that is looking at the questions related to the social costs of specific greenhouse gases. So not just carbon dioxide, but again, also methane and nitrous oxide and perhaps others. I think that it has to be left as an open question, given that it is a topic of ongoing research. But I think our intent is that we want to follow those emerging methods and follow the best practices. But we are not yet 100% certain where that will land. So I think we're identifying it more as an important topic to continue to follow, and that those recommendations may be updated in the future. Is that a fair summary, David?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jared. And thank you for the folks that gave the feedback last time on that, so that we help to clarify those. I think that they're important and helpful. So yeah.
We also clarified that in the modeling, especially the economic modeling, with relation to the LEAP model and the pathways there, that sensitivity analysis will be run so that we can understand and see what the choice of different discount rates other than 2%, what that would look like. So while there has to be a kind of default value chosen for the main analysis that's presented, and based on the consensus of this subcommittee and the polling exercise that was done, that would be 2%. We will also be able to see, and David, correct me if I don't know how many different values, but certainly the implications of a 1% discount choice could be reflected in the modeling. I don't know if there are additional that would be planned to be presented, as well as sensitivity analysis. But
Yeah, it is possible to change the discount rate that's used for the future costs. In this case, it would be the environmental externalities on that. And it's just as we think about those things, they're multiplicative. So you may do a sensitivity in one of your core cases, but not for all the different cases, because you just multiply out the sets of results that get to be a little bit cumbersome. But yes, some sensitivity on that, because it is an important factor for the evaluation of the avoided damages from the environmental externalities is important and can be done.
and that there's a somewhat kind of complicated, not yet fully settled discussion that I think that this committee will likely want to discuss further once the economic modeling is more teed up for discussion. And that is that the discount rate chosen for modeling a social cost of carbon is not necessarily the same discount rate that, and TJ has spoke to this. And so I just want to flag that, I know that there are different kind of opinions and perspectives on the implications of and the appropriate choice of different discount rates. And I think that will likely come up again in the future as discussion. And the intent is not that this is a settled, baked decision for perpetuity, but that there needed to be some default values and sensitivity analysis related values chosen just to get the modeling started. So I believe that is the plan going forward, and that's the main update. I believe that that final social cost of carbon paper that basically just has those very minor changes reflecting this past subcommittee's our past meeting, and the questions that came up in the council wanting to see, for instance, those appendices added and the language about the social cost of specific greenhouse gases added. I believe that will be available for sharing with this full subcommittee and the full council soon. Jane, David, I defer to you on that.
Yeah,
Great.
I think that I will double check to make sure. I think I sent those changes on yesterday, so you should have those.
Okay.
We have those, yep.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Jared. Are there any questions or comments on that update? Okay, hearing none, let's move just about right on time, I'll note, to the discussion of the greenhouse gas inventory work group and revisions to the memo that the task group have been working on over the last couple of weeks. And I guess I'm turning it back to Jared again to describe that one as well.
Thanks, TJ. So during our last subcommittee meeting, you'll remember that we went through the draft recommendations that came from the GHG task group. Some folks had some questions, particularly Secretary Moore. And so that task group reconvened around a revised draft that I sent around, trying to incorporate the feedback from Secretary Moore and also some additional feedback provided by task group members Richard Hopkins and Colin Smythe. And so we met earlier this week on Monday to go through a revised draft and came to consensus and agreement on that. And that's what was shared ahead of the meeting. That was included in the agenda as an attachment. I might just pull it up here and call out some of the specific updates. And Secretary Moore, please jump in and tell me if you want to characterize this differently. But
Okay.
mostly there were really no. It was, the changes on the first page were primarily related to spelling out acronyms, and there were not significant, substantial changes here. There was a couple places where there was additional information for purposes of clarity added, including around the renewable energy credits. But most of the focus was this good point brought up by Secretary Moore that it could be premature to point to actually conducting or issuing an RFP before we know what the different options for a supplemental analysis would be in response to the RFI. And depending on how an upstream emissions accounting or a life cycle emissions accounting is defined, depending on how emissions related to energy use is defined, there may be resources that already exist and methods that already exist to do that in a fairly direct manner that doesn't require a significant investment of resources. However, those terms could also be defined in a way that would point towards a significant new scope of work in terms of new data collection, new methods developed that we don't necessarily know the cost implications of that at this point. And so didn't want to recommend saying that we go ahead definitely with an RFP without gathering the information and having the questions responded to in an RFI first. So that's kind of the first step that is identified. We know that we want supplemental analysis. We also know that we need more information gathering and definitional clarity, especially around upstream and life cycle emissions, and especially related to, as it relates to energy use. And I'm confident that there is a commitment that we will do that supplemental analysis. The question is just, what are the resource implications of doing that? And then I think once we issue an RFP, get the responses, we can then come back to this question of, okay, then what is the next step after that? Are there available funds in the existing budget? Does it require a request of the legislature for further appropriations? So that's what you'll see, is that we don't specifically say we're going to do an RFP. It will depend on the responses to the RFI, but there is a clear intention here that we are moving in the direction of a tangible standalone supplemental accounting. We just want to do it carefully and thoroughly. And that in the meantime, we know that through the LEAP modeling, there is the ability, I'm pointing to this last paragraph, to do some sensitivity analysis that would use life cycle emissions factors for fuels that have already been developed, so that we can get an initial sense of what implications of using that type of analysis would be around some of the mitigation pathways and strategies that are being modeled. So I'm going to go ahead and stop share, because you all have this document, I believe, linked in the agenda. And I guess I would just pause to ask Secretary Moore or Richard or Colin or David if I missed anything that you think is important to add, or if you'd clarify anything that I said.
I thought you did a very nice job capturing that, Jared. Thank you.
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
No, me either. Thank you.
Okay, then with that, I guess I would ask if there are any members of the subcommittee who have clarifying questions or comments that you want to offer on this updated set of recommendations. And to be clear, the hope and the intention of that task group work was to get to a consensus document that we could share with the full subcommittee, and ideally get your agreement on that so that it could then be presented to the full council as our recommendation. And if we're able to do that today, then I think that would be added to the September 14th full council meeting agenda on Tuesday, September 14th.
I don't have anything to add specifically, but I just want to thank you, Jared, for kind of leading the task group, and for Richard and Julie, your participation in it to really get a clear document, I think, that really lays out the issues and recommendations of the subcommittee pretty well.
Thanks, TJ.
So before we actually go ahead and test for consensus here and kind of wrap this up, I think it's important to do the public comment first and see if there's issues that are raised that stoke some conversation amongst subcommittee members, or if there's questions that need to be answered. So why don't we open the floor to public comment now, a little bit earlier than was on the agenda, but is there any members of the public that would like to comment? George, welcome. Good to see you once your camera's on. Hi.
Hi. First off, thank you for carrying this forward as far as it has. I think it's certainly moving, albeit a little slower than I would like, in the right direction. It is moving in the right direction. One of my concerns is that, as you know, there's ongoing leak modeling for the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and then I gather in parallel for the Climate Council. And I guess, TJ, maybe you could speak to this directly. To what extent do you foresee taking the same methodologies used from the supplemental analysis in the Climate Council realm over to the Comprehensive Energy Plan? Would both results be published in the Comprehensive Energy Plan? One of the things that was conspicuous in the previous edition was the absence of any information about the modeling that was underneath what was presented to the public. And even if it's in an appendix, it would be constructive to have that information transparently shown.
So that question's related to the energy plan. I'll answer it briefly, but I want to, this committee is about the action plan, but because we're expecting the LEAP model, there's one model for the energy plan and for the action plan. And so the energy plan has taken the model to do kind of some initial analysis and summary of a few mitigation pathways. So a central mitigation strategy, and a bio-heavy approach, and a local electric resources approach. And results are kind of coming in as we speak and being revised and vetted. We'll talk at the cross-sector mitigation committee tomorrow, actually, a little bit, and with task groups there. And as far as emissions are concerned, this initial draft uses the emissions factors consistent with the inventory. And so what I would expect to be done, and as it goes forward, the climate action plan is going to then take kind of that base model and tweak it for policy considerations of the cross-sector committee, what the policy positions that are coming out of the climate action plan. And tweak is the wrong word, actually just run sensitivities or different scenarios based on the policies that are being kind of put forth and drafted in those committees. And like I said, right now it's the inventory emissions, but to the extent that we have emissions values that can be plugged into the LEAP modeling, then those can be shown as a sensitivity. And I would expect them to be shown. And, the timing is getting closer and closer here as we get to the fall, right? With both the energy plan and the action plan being due. And I would expect that the final versions of both of these would be consistent. So the action plan would test those sensitivities using any other emissions, could test those sensitivities using any other emissions coefficients that are available. And the energy plan would then in turn, take that information and present similar information. The modeling is going to be the modeling and then in the final energy plan report, at least, I know that we will be summarizing the model a bit up front and then having an appendix, a detailed appendix with all the assumptions that are going into the model. And kind of a little more detail on how the model works and that kind of stuff. I haven't talked about it with the action plan. I assume that would be available and make sense for the action plan too, but I can't confirm that one.
Okay, so take away from this, at some juncture in probably the next month or two, there would be a publication from you or others about the modeling results in some kind of a finished form that has some public visibility?
Yes, absolutely. So I imagine my forecast for that now is that it would come out with the draft that would be able to would be kind of open for feedback and public comment, and we'll be presenting it and be able to make adjustments for the final based on all that information. So, but we would expect to be publishing
Right.
it, yes.
So, for example, Hydro-Quebec is a major fraction of Vermont's energy supply, electricity. Obviously, the emissions factor, there are several options available in the peer review world, and they have a wide range. So it would seem likely that if you were to run the model, you would need to run with that particular emissions factor at several different settings. So I don't know how computationally expensive it is to do multiple runs, but that would be an example of a sensitivity analysis that makes a lot of sense to do. I might point out over the next decade, Hydro-Quebec has made statements both saying they are building no additional dams, and also some other indications are that they have future dams with commensurate increases in greenhouse gas emissions on the horizon. So it actually makes sense to model both outcomes from that perspective, a low and a high, high being more associated with new reservoirs. Independent of all the greenhouse gas emissions related factors, I noticed on page 1, we have RECs basically being the basis for measuring electricity or accounting for electricity. And I'm trying to understand the relationship of the RECs to these modeling exercises. When we do a modeling run, are we assuming that the RECs are being injected into the modeling to remove the counting of emissions? In that case, I think that's a little bit misleading, because RECs, even though they are counted typically on the books as zero emissions, are in fact, in reality not. They're gray RECs, really. Hydro-Quebec being the most prominent example, but for that matter, any of the other RECs you might have out there are also gray RECs. So I guess my question is there some way to revisit the current stance that's in that first page, that it's currently taking it as at face value as zero emissions, but in fact that's not really true. And I think that's an important distinction as we move forward from here, especially for regards to biomass, which is a biggie.
I just want to offer what I hope is a clarifying perspective. In that my sense is when we issue an RFI in terms of how we could conduct a standalone supplemental accounting to assess the upstream and/or life cycle emissions that result from our energy use in Vermont. That is the point at which I would assume we would identify a path for assessing the upstream or life cycle emissions with regard to, all energy use, but it specifically with regard to your questions about Hydro-Quebec, George. I do think that the recent peer-reviewed studies and other information that's coming out have been more to assess not the kind of point of power purchase emissions, but the life cycle emissions, including from reservoirs and including from construction of them, and then other points throughout that life cycle. As we should, and that would not just be my understanding. That would not just be for Hydro-Quebec. That would be for every electricity resource. And so I don't see the identification of using REC accounting on page 1 as saying anything about the needed upstream and supplemental analysis that we identify on page 2. I think it's just recognizing up front that that's how the region is doing it. That's how our laws and regulations and policies are set up in terms of the way that other states do their in-boundary accounting, with the lone exception of New Hampshire. But every other state in the region, is my understanding, is using their REC compliance as their basically electricity portfolio to assess their in-boundary, their emissions for what is overall an in-boundary inventory, but they're trying to settle the net purchases of what they're responsible for using, not just what they generate in their border. So all I'm trying to say is that I think that that identifying RECs as the way that we have done, other states are doing, and should continue to do the in-boundary inventory, is not to say that there shouldn't be a careful upstream or life cycle analysis of the emissions related to those RECs in the supplemental analysis. I just see them as separate questions, because we don't want to get into a situation around double counting with regard to the in-boundary inventory. I would also invite Colin to, of course, who's the lead author and real expert on this, comment if I mischaracterized or anything, or if you'd want to add to that.
No, I think you covered it, Jared. I mean, it's certainly a very complicated topic and probably warrants further discussion just in general, but no, I think what you said makes sense. Thank you.
And I think we'll go to Richard next. I do have a clarification on the LEAP modeling and its treatment of RECs as well, but go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, hi. I promised the other day that I'm not going to say anything about RECs, and I'm going to keep to that promise, at least for now. But I think that the language that's in the memo currently does a good job of staying neutral with respect to technologies and sources of energy. And I think that's really important. Each of us tends to have a favorite among the various alternatives and some that we really dislike, and perhaps for good reason. And we need to be sure that in our analytic approach that we treat all the different ways that we generate and use electricity in the same way, which means that we can't just look at, for example, methane emissions from reservoirs that are used by Hydro-Quebec. We also have to look at solar and wind as potential sources of greenhouse gases as well. But we need to look at all of them equally and evenly.
Thank you, Richard. I very much agree with that statement. And the clarification I just wanted to make on the modeling. So when I said it was consistent with the inventory, I meant in terms of resources, as in a hydro resource or a solar resource or a biomass resource, and use the emission factors that the inventory would apply to a kind of a one of those resources, as opposed to what the model doesn't get into detail of is, do we get that hydro from Hydro-Quebec? Do we get it from the Green River Reservoir? Do we get it from the Connecticut River? And so the detail of kind of that particular power supply source, while in the near term, some of those contracts are reflected in the kind of broad category of hydro in the model, the model doesn't kind of get into that detail of a particular power supply source or the RECs associated with it. And so, we could, run a sensitivity of the hydro in the model, comes from Hydro-Quebec versus it comes from the Connecticut River. But that gets into a lot more complication. And I think the model is better suited at some of these higher level accounting of, to give kind of indicative results, as opposed to that detail of power supply sources or RECs. The model is essentially like a mini ISO New England, but for Vermont. And so it doesn't kind of get into some of the nuance we're talking about here. And but I'm happy to talk more with you, George, about that maybe offline. I feel like we're getting pretty far into the model. I want to refocus on the memo here and discussion on that.
If it's all right, just directly on that point, and I just want to test an understanding that I have, and David, please, or others, add if you don't think this is accurate, or if there's additional information that's relevant. And that is that, I think that my sense is that I'm not aware of life cycle analysis or upstream analysis in terms of emissions factors for different RECs or classes of RECs or electricity sources that have been done in the Vermont or even New England context or Northeast context that would be ready to simply input into a model. I think when we say, what are the available emissions factors that we could run as sensitivity analysis, the ones that are ready are related to fuels and that have been tested, peer reviewed. There's multiple groups that have done that, from Argonne National Labs, as you have pointed us to, among others, George. And it feels to me like the easiest, straightforward way to run that sensitivity analysis will be with relation to fuels, both all fossil fuels that we track in the inventory, any biofuels for which there are known emissions factors. But I do think that doing that type of analysis with regard to RECs, I'm not aware that those are kind of ready to go. And I think that is likely to have to be a longer term project.
I've been doing work in that area. I concede that it is a fairly complicated and prickly beast, but not impossible to tame either. It does take more work than we would like. So you're, in that sense, that's an ongoing project I've got in my back pocket. It's been on the back burner for a while, but it's something I think I have a handle on enough to know the process by which you could solve it, even if that's not in hand at the minute.
Great. Dave Westman.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. And on this topic of RECs, I actually had a clarifying question. It's somewhat related to my comments in the subcommittee's last meeting, and without going too far into those weeds, I did just want to sort of ask for a clarification on, because I can respect the fact that emissions from these from renewable sources and upstream emissions from renewable sources can be very complicated, and that could in fact be a longer term topic. But when I review the EFG Cadmus paper recommending that the RECs not be applied to the state's inventory, it seems to be more on the basis of synchronicity, and that the renewable energy credits are more on like the annual balancing basis and not on the renewable energy is in the moment providing renewable energy for the actual load in Vermont. And so when I look at the full memo from EFG Cadmus, it says that RECs shouldn't be applied unless or to the extent that you can clarify or prove that that generation source is synchronous and in line with the current load of Vermont. And I'm just wondering if we could sort of take a step away from this. You know, what is the methane emissions from a hydro dam, and more focus on, you know, this seems like a technical point that EFG Cadmus raised in their memo that isn't actually being addressed here in the final recommendations. Thank you.
Hi, Dave. Thanks. I'm actually not certain what language in the memo you're referring to or in our report. So maybe we should take that offline. Our recommendation as the team is pretty consistent with what you were saying, is that the RECs are used for an annual accounting to make sure that there aren't under or over counting of the renewable energy generation in the region. So if Vermont is exporting RECs, we want to make sure that those exported RECs aren't counted as renewable in Vermont's mix. And so it's more of an accounting, as you said, and that is appropriate. That's the regional basis for settling of the renewable energy generation, to make sure that, you know, you don't have two cows where there's really only one. But the more specific point on you know, matching that to load and synchronous with the load and stuff, I'm not recalling that. I'd be happy to take that offline and we could exchange email, but I'm just not, my mind may be a little fuzzy, but I'm not recalling that.
Yeah, no problem, Dave. We can take it offline. I did just drop into the chat the paragraph from page 63 of 72 where that appeared, and I'll just also include in the chat here that page reference. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I wonder, not to get too far into the weeds, but I wonder, looking at that language just quickly right now, Dave, if this is similar to the previous conversation where that recommendation is relative to and relevant to the life cycle analysis that would be done, but would not affect the in-boundary.
That's what you were, yeah. I mean, that, yes, that seems to make sense. So yeah, yep.
I may need to need to understand that a little bit more, because I was seeing this more as the recommendation coming from this paper as being take a look at the average emission profile of the grid that Vermont is pulling energy from, and only to the extent that you can tie a renewable energy credit to the synchronous load of Vermont at the time when it's being generated, it's also being consumed in Vermont, that it should be applied. I was taking this recommendation at plain language to just basically account for the inventory based on the average emission profile of the ISO New England grid without any exception for the REC. And I may be misreading that, but I think that was the plain language reading I had.
Is it, sorry, I'm hesitating as to whether we should continue on this path, but is it synchronous to, Vermont's electrical loads on an annual basis. That's how I would have read. I read that, as opposed to in kind of synchronous, kind of in the instantaneous, or on the margin.
Yeah, Dave, thank you for raising this. I tend to see this as, I don't think that this is very workable, and I would not, I might edit or modify this paragraph here. I think that the rec accounting, the recommendation on the rec accounting is more appropriate for the annual settlement, so your overall profile and mix. But the rec accounting would not allow for, without a great deal of complexity. And, you know, the rec accounting is not going to be, recs are not going to be tied to their, to the explicit load profile of one each rec. You would have to differentiate each rec in terms of its, you know, that generation source's output in each hour, et cetera. And that is not reasonable. So your point is well taken. I'm not certain that this language is accurately reflecting. Again, I think it's more appropriate that it's the annual accounting and the settlement of recs on the regional basis to make sure that there's not more renewable generation being counted than is actually on the grid. But it is not at the hourly basis, and that a rec is only a rec if it's consistent with your, you know, load and generation profile. That goes beyond what the rec accounting has done in the region.
Yeah, I do understand that. Yeah, that the GIS system is not set up for that hourly accounting.
Yeah. So if that's your point, I agree.
Can I
Yeah.
interject? I'm not certain of this, but that language looks very familiar because it seems like I might have been the author of it. And I think it might be the possibility that it was included in an appendix of your main report. I don't know this for sure. Is that possible?
I apologize. I haven't read through the report just in the last, prior to this meeting. I'm not certain. As I said, I wasn't familiar with the language, but yes, I could see that could be something that we took as one of the comments that we received, and it may be as part of, is this in the actual open letter to the Climate Council? This is in the open letter to the Climate Council appendix, perhaps.
It's not labeled as an appendix. It
Okay.
just says E, an open letter to the Vermont.
I think we need to take it offline.
I'm just, is this creating an issue with the way that the memo is written and the potential adoption of the report, or adoption of that memo? And I don't believe it does. I see Jared shaking his head no, but I want to focus at the task at hand is to kind of consider this memo. And I appreciate the point being raised that there may be some confusion in the report that we're essentially adopting, but I do still want to focus on our
I think it would be relevant. I was just going to say, I think it would be relevant if there was a conflict between our recommendations and what was actually recommended in the EFG Cadmus report. But I think that it's become clear that was from the open letter and language that George provided, and therefore there is not inconsistency between our 2 pages of recommendations to the full council and the EFG Cadmus report, and that those questions that George identified, I think are important questions. We're just not ready for that level of detail yet, as it regards, and may need to be looked into as we gather the information and ask the questions we need about how we do the upstream and life cycle supplemental analysis.
And I agree. I just looked. That is from, and we felt it was important to include as an appendix if it's not clear. That is the open letter to the Climate Council. And so that request is directly from George's letter to the Climate Council. And so that's something that we did not recommend in the Cadmus EFG report. But we felt that it was important to have appendices that documented some of the inputs that we had gotten. So sorry.
That's very helpful to understand.
Sorry for not being clear on that. Yeah.
I would have, yes, it would have been very helpful to know that there was a different author, because when I read it that way, it actually read like it was an open letter from the study authors to the Climate Council. So I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
No such luck. Obviously, setting it for a title that says an appendix, I appreciate the inclusion of that letter. Obviously, it reaffirms the questions that it brought to the table that needed to be addressed, and the EFG report did proceed to do that. So it's useful to have both in context to provide that.
So are there any other comments on the memo? Any other public comments on the memo? Hearing none. Thank you, George and Dave, for raising those issues. Thank you for the discussion, and again, thank you for the folks on the subcommittee who've led this process to this point. There's more to come, but it's been a lot of work, and this is one of the big issues that we needed to tackle this year. And with that, I want to, I guess I'll frame it this way. Are there objections from subcommittee members to forwarding the memo and the EFG report to the full council and presenting the memo as a consensus recommendation from the subcommittee?
It's fine by me.
Me too.
Right. Great. I'm hearing no objections. I couldn't hear you, Lou. I saw your thing go on and off. Was that?
Yes, I'm okay with this. Yeah.
Okay, great. So with that, I think we have a consensus decision, and we'll forward that. This will be expected to be on the September 14th agenda of the full Climate Council.
Thank you, everybody. I know it's not fully settled yet, but it's good to be making progress and moving this forward.
Yeah, and thank you, Jared, for your yeoman's work in getting it to this point.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks to the whole task group. And of course to David and Liz and the EFG and Cadmus team that did the report. Made it really easy to make those recommendations with the clarity of how their report came out.
Great. So we're a little bit ahead of schedule this week, which is great. I did have a 5-minute break put into the agenda, but we've only been at it less than an hour. So do folks want a break, or you want to forge ahead?
Onward.
Thank you, Julie. That's what I was hoping people would say. But so next up on the agenda is the cross-cutting systems task group, and they've made some progress here, and I'm going to turn it to Leslie Ann. Welcome today, and take it away.
Thanks, TJ. Not sure how well you can hear me. This is it's our seminar room, so I'm doing this for the first time here and switching gears mentally. So hopefully this will all sort of come across a little bit coherently. So what we've tried to do is to see if we can get some clarity, some forward motion around some of the cross-cutting themes that we had been talking about almost 2 months ago now. And there are two groups that I chatted with, apart from TJ yesterday, in trying to move some of this forward. The first one is the some of the folks from the cross-cutting themes group itself, and then the second group is some of our colleagues who sit in different agencies across the state. And because there's a lot of overlap in some of the thoughts that are coming forward, I put together those thoughts as they stand right now in one document, which I believe I sent across to Jared and TJ. And I don't know if you were able to look at it or not, but I'm going to try and bring that up on my screen here. So let me know what you're seeing.
I see it now. The cross-cutting
Yes.
theme task group.
I can see it.
Okay. All right. So just to give this a little bit of framing, when we first met back in June, some of the things that sort of risen up to the top were there were some themes that were coming across in a number of different subcommittees and others that didn't seem to have a home at that particular point in time, but also wanting to lift up and speak to the work that was coming out of Just Transitions and the ways in which we could try to incorporate all of the principles that had been lifted up. And so the members of the two groups, be they as they are sort of listed at the top there. And I wanted just to go back to that overarching framework diagram that I had created on the fly back in June, because I had some conversations with Lynn Whitecloud, who's an assistant dean here at the University of Vermont, as well as Chief Don Stevens, both of the Abenaki peoples, and sort of revisited the way in which some of this framing was actually coming across. And so I just wanted to offer back up that diagram that we had seen once or twice, and sort of rejig it a little bit in putting equity-centered framing as a lens at the front of everything that we're trying to do as part of offering up various mitigation, adaptation, resilience strategies. And the additional piece in here is in speaking with Chief Stevens and speaking with Lynn Whitecloud, adding the Indigenous ways of knowing as part of the framing that we are looking at. And also sort of honoring some of the public input that we've received from Monique Thurston and Annette Smith in thinking about all of the ways in which some of the energy alternatives that we could be offering up or might be on the docket could be thought of in terms of both the human impacts as well as the environmental impacts. And so those are some of the tweaks that I added to this diagram. I sort of shared that with the UVM community last week when I had to do a keynote. So what we've tried to do is to come up with a clear purpose of why we are looking at this from a cross-cutting perspective, and sort of the focus on our physical climate change and the implications of those, as well as making sure that we lift up strategies that address adaptation to climate change, resilience to climate change, all of the natural hazard impacts. And then how are we actually monitoring and assessing a lot of the items that are listed in statute, but also some that we have been identifying over the last few months, particularly with reference to the adaptation, resilience, and natural hazards pieces in here. So I just wanted to sort of put that as a frame as to how we're trying to think about some of these things in here. So as I step on through, again, this is less than 24 hours old, and so it has not been fully fleshed out. I think Jay had to pop off. Was that a message in the chat? So did he have to pop off to go teach?
I didn't see the recent message, but earlier he did say he had a class this
Okay.
afternoon.
So we're taking turns here. I pop on and he pops off.
Right, yes.
Got it. Okay. So a lot of this stuff has not been fully fleshed out. It is by way of stimulating conversation here today. And so as I was talking with TJ yesterday, thinking of this as maybe two bookends, with one bookend being the sort of front chapter pieces of the climate, weather, climate change hazards piece in the actual writing of the plan itself. And Jay and I would be sort of helping to spearhead a lot of that. But then the other sort of bookend would be a lot of those data gaps, knowledge gaps, information gaps that we either have identified or are going to be identifying. And so to sort of frame or brace the inputs to the plan from that perspective. And so that first bullet point here talks about that front bookend, that front chapter piece in those elements. And then this fourth bullet point here talks about the back end bookend in terms of trying to make sure that we are having an assessment strategy that actually makes sure that we are responding to what's in the statute, as well as the pieces that have been identified. And then the two bullet points in the middle are the what's being identified as either pathways or strategies that speak to pieces of adaptation, resilience, and natural hazards, as well as pieces that are not being captured in other subcommittees or in other places. And so one example of, like I said, less than 24-hour thinking around some of this might look something like this, where we are talking about, and we're using that pathway strategy actions, which the other subcommittees are framing their recommendations or their thinking around. If we think about it from a climate change data gap perspective, and how some of those data gaps could then inform either policies or programs that are coming down the pipe, the strategy would be to think about what are some of the metrics and data for actually evaluating that. And some of the specific actions that we've thought about would be, for example, the climate resilience toolkit, which the URL is across it here, has 5 steps to resilience that allow you to, for a particular hazard, for a particular risk, to then identify the vulnerabilities and then to create an actual plan to address some of those vulnerabilities, whether it's in an adaptation space or in a resilience space. And the toolkit also has a climate resilience screening index, which may be of use here for us to apply. So that's one type of action that can come out of this. Another action that can come out of this may be related to land use and land cover, and the ways in which we can bring our demographic information into the conversation here. Again, as part of looking at how peoples and the environment sort of come together. And then the last piece around here is particularly apropos on a day like today, where Chris, for example, Chris Campany has been spending his last 2 weeks responding to not just Ida and Fred and all of the excess moisture, excess precipitation that's been falling in the southern part of the state, but not in the northern part of the state. And having things like who is affected? Are they resilient? How are we adapting to this additional amount of moisture? Really, really front and center on a lot of the things that are taking place right now as we speak. And so that is one piece in here. And so I'm going to pause for a sec and ask if there are clarifying questions, concerns, pieces that folks would like to raise before we look at the second piece.
Julie, go ahead.
Sure. Just want to appreciating what we're trying to do here. I'm concerned about it getting too deep into the actions without engaging some of the other subcommittees. Although maybe your membership covers that Leslie Ann, and that you have people from each of them. But just to, specifically, I guess the first one I thought about was the adopting the resilience toolkit, and if that is in effect going to be one and the same with the Municipal Vulnerability Index, I think that the Global Warming Solutions Act requires us to develop. And appreciating this is an early draft, and just want to make sure sort of all the pieces move together and as close to lockstep as possible.
Absolutely. And again, because we haven't had a lot of conversation around this, it's a chance to at least start the conversation. So this is not set in stone. It's not a be all end all. It's something to actually stick something at. And I think that's what, folks always ask for. Like
Yeah, a straw man to react
right,
to.
moving beyond the esoteric. So
Great. No, excellent.
sorry, I'm on two machines here at the same time, so I can't see hands. So if somebody else could manage.
Yeah, sure. I can do that. Richard.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie Ann. I'm reminded of a number of similar problems that I dealt with as a public health official. There's certainly a big overlap here. I just have a couple of thoughts that may be helpful. One is that there are, I'm sure in state government, people who understand social statistics for the population of Vermont better than any of us who tend to be natural scientists and hard science people. I'm sure there are people in state government who understand far better than I what kinds of data are available about who has needed and who has benefited from assistance of various kinds. And I'm not sure we have the right people at the table yet, although perhaps I don't know all the people you've been talking to, so that comment may be off base. The other thing is just as a throw out as a thought experiment, whether there's a way to phrase equity goals as positive statements that are where we want to be. So, for example, we have some ways to measure energy burden in households. The cost burden of energy purchases in households. So, is there a way to say, the energy burden in household, the excess energy burden in households will be either that it will be zero or that it will be equal in all the subpopulations that you might identify. Stating the goals in a positive way that reflect what would the world look like if it was more just than it is now. What would it look like, and what could we measure that would reflect that justice? And then the third thing is, again, I don't know the Vermont situation all that well, but typically many programmatic data streams that are captured about people that are helped or served in various ways in many states don't capture race, ethnicity, home language, immigration status very well or very systematically, and perhaps not uniformly. And so if you want to have a data system that demonstrates that the impact of energy cost or the impact of energy of strategies that we might take is not burdensome to disadvantaged communities, you need to have data systems that collect information about who is in fact a member of those disadvantaged communities. So that's it. That's my spiel for now.
thanks, Richard.
Jane, go ahead.
So I have like a question to ask all of you, and maybe not an answer to it myself, but it's like a process question around the second idea that you put forward, Leslie Ann. And it has as I had my hand up and was ruminating on it, I was looking at the language and to identify cross-cutting themes that have not been identified elsewhere, and to create the pathway strategies and actions language used by other subcommittees to date. So my challenge to that, or my question, the way I see like a support and a process working well in this space, is not to identify, but to pull together the ideas and themes that are emerging from subcommittees that are cross-cutting, and particularly with the jurisdiction of this committee, specifically thinking about those as they relate to the scientific and data needs of those ideas in order to drive those forward with respect to how we would make progress on those ideas. So it's like many of the ideas below that you used as an example, like one says it is pulled from Ag and Eco, so that makes a lot of sense. You would assimilate it in one place to make it more impactful. But like many of the other things are also ideas already being explored by other subcommittees. So it feels like what would be helpful in my mind is not to create new ideas in a new committee, but to empower and enable the ideas coming out of the other subcommittees that are cross-cutting, that have data and science questions associated with them, and then to have this expert group considering those in one place to prioritize, to enhance, to put strength to those going forward, but not to identify new ones. Does that make sense? Right, my question, and do you see it that way?
I think I do, and I think maybe the word identifies where the hang up is probably occurring, because the whole point of this is, so part of how this all came about is I actually spent some time either listening to or watching some of the other subcommittee meetings and hearing similar things sort of pop up in other places, and sort of like, I wish I had been in that one, and I'd have put my hand up and said, but that was also discussed here. And then another one's like, oh yeah, but we're doing this over here. And so there's a lot of that going on. And so to the extent that it can all be pulled together, culled together in one place, maybe identifies the wrong verb, but it's that sort of like, but didn't I just hear that here? And this group was talking to that. And classic example is, so I came on only in the last 20 minutes because I was giving my keynote, and I just heard the tail end of Richard Coward say something about, is that something that science and data is looking at? And so I emailed him like, Richard, what were you trying to ask us about? But I still haven't heard back from him as yet. And so those are some of the things that maybe cross pieces that we could be talking about that we're not talking about. And so how do we actually do that so that we don't end up with the same thing written twice or 3 times or 4 times?
And then obviously we're talking about the CAP drafting process. This task within this subcommittee feels related to science and data specifically. And then there's this CAP drafting process that has one of the responsibilities articulated in that would be around cross-cutting themes at a different level. So do you feel like the work here is related to science and data, and then there's likely a different body that speaks specifically to themes? Because that's a little, there's a task here, but then there's also a group that will likely include some of the people on this group, but also we're opening it up to more counselors to participate and state staff who are not in this conversation right now. So how do you see those working together?
I don't see them as different, because I think I responded in an email to you earlier that since we have at least 3 people in both settings, it's not as if one set of thinking will be the same here and different in somewhere else. And so to the extent that at the end of the day, we're just helping to make the plan as good as it can be in whatever shape or form that looks like, whether it is content-wise, whether it is getting the right people at the table-wise. How can we make the plan the best possible plan that Vermont can have at this particular point in time? And so my strength, my expertise is in the content area. And that's what I'm hoping to bring to bear to a lot of this. So I don't see it as being an either or. It's wherever can I best be effective in helping to write all of the pieces that should be written.
Yeah, I think that one of the things this is really helping clarify for me is that there are likely many kind of components of that will eventually end up in the climate action plan, including as recommendations that are being discussed by multiple subcommittees. And I think we're trying to do our best with liaisons and having, a monthly steering committee where the chairs of those subcommittees get together. But but I feel like listening to what you're saying, Leslie, and I totally agree that it's likely, and you, Jane, that it's some of these things are only going to kind of come to a point of clarity about what is the recommendation once those are collectively being surfaced as the plan is drafted. And there may be things that, you know, one subcommittee wants to phrase one way, another way. And so I think that this is likely helpful to try to identify some of these things earlier rather than later. And you know, we may see some of the substance and language come forward from other subcommittees, but I think that it just feels like it's inevitable that a lot of this is, you know, only going to be able to be fully identified and resolved once we're in the drafting process.
And I think too, Jared, I think we saw that really, really clearly on the meeting on the 26th of July, where everybody was presenting the things that they had been working on, and then you started seeing some of those commonalities come out. So just to speak to your point of the more that we talk to each other, the more we start to see, oh, we're all sort of like thinking along similar lines here. And so how can we make sure that those similar lines are like similar lines, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to raise my hand so I can get in line, but go ahead, Julie.
Okay, I was going to be happy for you to go first too, TJ.
Well, okay, I'll go, because it's kind of on that theme, I guess. And if you scroll up a little bit, Leslie, and in that bullet there, I think this gets to what we're talking about. But first of all, thank you for putting this together. I think this is giving some direction to this part of the committee's task, so I very much appreciate it. But on this bullet here, the second one on the page, the question I come up with is how, because I agree with Jared to some extent that there's, you know, the drafting process, this is going to happen organically, but I also think that there's a piece where there may be some assumptions by people that, to Leslie and your point, that, hey, well, science and data is taking care of that, and they'll know about it, and they will draft it. And is there a role here for our committee to, you know, try and do a better job to reach out and survey the other committees, for lack of a better word, informally get input, say, hey, what are the data needs that you need for us to address? Not to say that we can get the data by December 1st, but we could think about, you know, the priority of that data, and we can think about how we might want to get it if we want to get it. So that was long-winded, but the question is really how do we go about this bullet here?
And I think I was actually asking John Adams about shared docs earlier and what that would look like if folks were to drop in what their needs were in one central place. So then, you know, let's say somebody from cross-sector dropped in some stuff. So Jared, you might have some specific examples of things that, you know, have been coming up in cross-sector, like I wish we had, or maybe I should bring that back to science and data. If we started actually writing those down, then other folks could be like, I have the same need. And then we can get a sense of how many times these things keep coming up and what they are and where they're surfacing, so we can actually, if we have the data, or if we have those questions answered, or if we have whatever already started in the process, then it'll be like, okay, we can speak to that. If not, we're like, all right, here's that list of things that we wish we had, we don't have right now, and where do we put that? So I think you and I, TJ, had talked about some sort of spreadsheet on what's the most efficient way to try and capture some of those things. This is where I'm gonna, lean on you and other folks within state government who know what some of those processes are and what are the mechanisms for capturing information and sharing information like that.
Right. And so Jane has highlighted one concern about public meeting requirements. I think that's a problem if it's it wouldn't be something that the whole subcommittee had access to, but if just the chairs of subcommittees had access to, or certain members, so as to not have a quorum in any individual subcommittee or across the whole council. My understanding is that you could actually do it that way, but I could be wrong, and Jane, please correct me if I'm wrong. And then have it be something that ultimately is shared with the full group publicly once. Otherwise, I guess it has to be just somebody's in control of a document and asking everybody kind of to respond individually. But go ahead, Jane. Looked like you were going to respond to that.
Yes, we can figure out a way to do that. As task leads have figured out ways to work on documents when not in open meetings the same way. I'm still stuck on, like, we're spending a significant amount of time thinking about how we're going to draft the cap, and one of the responsibilities in that process that procedurally we're taking up at the steering committee next week and then with the council talks specifically about elevating cutting ideas. So I'm just sort of getting stuck on, like, that if we're getting ahead of a process for cap drafting as we're trying to formalize the process in the steering committee and council meeting around what that looks like. So it just feels, I'm stuck on that, but yes, we can figure out a document.
Leslie, and I'll let you respond too, but maybe I'm reading this too narrowly, but I'm thinking about this in the context of specific data needs going forward. But that may not be exactly what you were thinking of here, Leslie, Ann, in terms of cross-cutting themes. So we should figure that out.
And I think to answer both you, TJ and Jane, this may require a little bit more conversation among the group itself. And so I'm not gonna speak for anybody or speak for the entire group because we have not actually done that much of a deep dive. So if it pleases the group, if we can put a pin in that for right now until we have a little bit more clarity, because if you don't have clarity, then we're all sort of like just being unclear together, jointly, cross-cuttingly unclear. And I hope you got my smile with my eyes.
Julie, I thought I saw your hand up again, but maybe
you did. No, I've been switching devices back and forth because my computer demanded it restart right now. Gave me the choice of right now or 5 minutes from right now. So apologies. I just want to reflect a growing concern I have and expect Jane probably shares, but maybe too polite to say, which is just trying to think about what's realistic between now and December 1st and what is like things we sort of more broadly, to use, I think it was your words, Leslie, Ann, although maybe TJ said it, to put a pin in it, to come back to it. We have so many open fronts right now. And I feel like, part of what we've done this afternoon is close a couple of them by being able to move forward the greenhouse gas inventory and previously the work around the social cost of carbon. But, today's September 1st. So 3 months from today, we have to have adopted a plan. And I just increasingly worry that appreciating we don't want to lose any of these important ideas and areas in need of our attention ultimately to make sure that we are sort of realistic about what we're going to be able to really lean into over the next 3 months.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can share that concern, just thinking about the energy plan, which is technically, I guess, due a month later, but not really. But you know, when I guess it's very it should be very front of mind as Leslie, and you take this task group and think about this. The reason I was focused on data needs in this, because I think that's like a core piece of the work plan that this subcommittee is tasked to do. And again, I think of it as whether it ends up in an appendix or as informing little pieces of the actual action plan, that we need to know what we don't know and what we need to get going forward. And so I guess as you think about it, my vote would be, even though we have a lot of things going, that this is one that we should one piece of it anyway that we should continue with.
Okay, so I've got, what am I up to now? My usual 3 pages of notes from all of the ideas and concerns that have just been shared, so that I can take them back, because I don't think there's anybody on here right now from the group itself. So I will take those back to the group so that we can chit chat a little bit about it. Would it make sense to move to the next piece, or?
I do just have one more quick comment, and it's on the first bullet on this page. And I just, I think that this is all happening, and I assume it is, but my sense is it'd be really useful if, Jane, you could give an end date for Leslie Ann and Jay to kind of fill in those 3 pieces by, and then we can back up and have a date by which that's shared with the subcommittee, so that there can be that public, opportunity here to kind of have the discussion about what you've written, and then any revisions by that end date. That doesn't have to happen today, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Marion and I have been doing some legwork behind the scenes around components of the CAP and timelines, so that the council is getting all the components of the CAP in a timely fashion over the course of the next 2 months, so that when a comprehensive draft goes to the Climate Council in mid to late November, that they will have seen every individual piece all along the way. And so that complete climate action plan won't be like the first time they're seeing it and have to adopt it 2 weeks later. So that timeline is something that we've been working on in anticipating meeting with a CAP drafting team in the course of the next week or 2 as the council approves that group and councilors step forward. So I don't want to put a date on it right now, but I expect all components of the CAP will have had their airtime with the council by the first week of November, because that's the only way we'll move towards having a comprehensive draft in November. So over the course of the next few weeks, we'll have to be seeing different components of the CAP for review by subcommittees to then put up to the council. But that the exact date will be decided on with input from the councilors after that process is approved.
So that's really helpful. So I heard that the full council needs to see it at the beginning of November, which means that the subcommittee needs to see it prior to that. Okay. That's helpful in thinking about the work plan and if for the subcommittee going forward. And I'm sure for Leslie Ann and Jay for writing that front chapter with the CAP drafting process as well. Okay, that's all I had. I think we could move on, Leslie Ann. That would be great.
Okay, is Brian on?
Brian,
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
I'm
Brian?
the note taker today.
Are you?
Yeah, I was a late nominee.
Good for you. All right, so I'm actually gonna sort of turn this over to Brian. The second piece here, because he spearheaded a lot of the thinking around that, the monitoring and assessment. And when we were chatting as a group yesterday, reminded us, he pulled out the pieces from the statute that we have these requirements around. And so there are 7 of these that we are speaking to. And these are these 7 that are listed here. And this sort of goes back to your point, TJ, about the data needs and the assessment around those pieces and what we know, what we don't know, and what still needs to be collected. And so, Brian, if you want to jump in at this point, and then what I've done is I've actually sort of listed the task at the end here that is addressed to Cadmus. So David, if you wanted to say anything about that, we'll get to that point. And I'm not sure if John is on. John had put together some overarching framing pieces around data collection. So I'm going to come back to here and turn this over to Brian. And Brian, if you wanted to take it away for a sec.
Yeah, just for a moment. Oh, forgive my background. I always try to have new backgrounds for different meetings, and I didn't change this one. But yes, if you could scroll up just a little bit, Leslie Ann, and I will be brief. I do want to give credit to the entire staff group that engaged in this discussion. And it's about the monitoring and assessment strategy for the climate action plan. As it says here, BSA 592 identifies 7 goals that the plan needs to achieve. We've talked about 2 of them extensively: the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and achievement of the net zero emission targets. And they have discrete objective numerical targets. But the other 5, and those are below, and you can scroll down a little bit, Leslie, remaining that are related to smart growth, sequestration, land use management, energy burdens, which we talked about just before in this meeting, limit use of chemicals, and build and encourage climate adaptation. Those don't have objective targets or goals or metrics associated with them. And so in order to be able to develop a robust and comprehensive monitoring plan, I think we need to, or the science and, or this group recommends that science and data begins to think about what are the goals or metrics, what are the baselines for these when we talk about, for example, encouraging or reducing energy burdens. Do we have baseline data that we can work at? Do we want to either propose or solicit some kind of targets for these these issues or these topic areas, and then to develop a monitoring plan that allows us to track progress towards achieving those goals. That's really the long and the short of it. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments.
Jane, go ahead.
I was happy just briefly to touch on what related to monitoring and assessment that we have currently covered under our technical services contract with Cadmus and EFG versus also anticipated technical analysis that we're doing. I think you are all familiar with the mitigation components of our technical analysis contract, but there's also obviously a direct link with the mitigation around monitoring and assessment that Cadmus and EFG have within their contract to propose a tool on how we will track emissions and how we will track the impact of our policy decisions and strategies that we put forward and their impact on emissions. So the mitigation component of the monitoring and assessment is well within the Cadmus ESG contract, but also I would argue that within their contract, they're doing the carbon budget, which arguably is just a snapshot in time but we also have been working with Jonathan Thompson of Harvard, who has done forecasting around sequestration to do what he's done for some of our neighboring states for Vermont. And so what it would do is very similarly to mitigation, look at a business as somewhat simplistic view would be a business as usual model on what sequestration will do over the course of that aligned with the emissions reduction targets. So in 2025, 2030, and 2050, based on current policies in place and our trends with sequestration. And then we would also be able to make some decisions and try to understand about the impacts that we have with respect to sequestration through the analysis that he would run. He's submitted a scope of work around that, and we're considering that and expect that if we move forward with it, that would be an action to invest in implementation of this climate action plan to further inform sequestration policies and ideas going forward. And then I'll just say that around resilience and adaptation, like anything with monitoring and assessment, we should be thinking about in line with the subcommittees, largely because they're trying to set measurable goals in that space. So it would make a lot of sense to ensure that if we're going to track progress, that we would tie back tracking that progress to the goals that they set and adopt as subcommittees.
So I guess I have a question on how much of this, when I think about setting up goals for things like reducing energy burdens, and as Brian mentioned, kind of where's the data, what data do we have along those lines to start from as a baseline, how much of this needs to be in the climate action plan and that we need to resolve by December 1st, as opposed to how much needs to be in the rules that then implement the climate action plan. I don't really know the answer to that, except, and it says that the plans shall set forth the specific initiatives and programs and strategies, but you know, how specific do we feel like we need to get here, given the short time frame?
Is that a rhetorical question, TJ, or just something to pause it?
Something to pause it, I guess, and for the group to think about maybe is, I'm skeptical, maybe on this one, I'm more along the lines of Julie's earlier comment of, I don't think we can come up with a specific goal on energy burden that gets the right data and understands, just sets a reachable target, et cetera, in the next 3 months. But I think that we could set up some frameworks for the rulemaking to establish something like that, or and there's a big difference in what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what it is that we are trying to accomplish, or just articulate that a little more here. And maybe we're not ready for that yet.
I'm just capturing all these thoughts and notes here. So if you see me not saying anything, that's what's going on. And I know Brian's the official note taker, but I'm just capturing some of these again to take it back to the group.
Yeah, Leslie, and same here, because I think a lot of these questions are not for you or I. I think these are for the subcommittee members.
It really is. If I were to answer it, I would focus on the measurement of these things as opposed to setting the targets, really, and the initiatives and programs. Like, if if weatherization were adopted by the cross-sector mitigation, that is, that helps to achieve net zero emissions. It helps to reduce energy burdens. So I don't know how specific we need to get, but we need to be able to track it. And I think that is the important thing here. Is there any other discussion or thoughts on this here?
Yeah, I mean, I've really appreciated this discussion and the work that's gone into it. Leslie Ann and Brian and others. I guess where my mind is going is the balance between what can we identify and recommend in the plan, in the draft plan in the months ahead, and then the initial plan December 1st, and then what would be identified for further work by us as a subcommittee beyond the submission of the plan. And this just to me relates to this broader kind of framing question that I keep coming back to, which is I feel like there's a lot of kind of public conversation and comment that is kind of all about, the initial plan by December 1st, as though that's all the council is about. And I try to keep reminding myself and anybody else who's willing to listen that, most of us were appointed to 3-year terms or 2-year terms. The council is meant to exist on an ongoing basis and to do revisions and updates to the plan to produce future plans. And so I think that, as that initial deadline gets closer of December 1st, it's just going to be this process of what do we know enough now and have enough consensus and clarity that we can include, and what are the recommendations that kind of add up to meeting those requirements where we do have clarity, especially on the emissions reduction requirements, because that is the clearest one, versus where are there other places where there needs to be further definition of goals, filling of data gaps, and is that a recommendation to do it, or is it a recommendation of a process to explore how we do it? I think that some of these, the pathways, strategies, and actions framework makes a lot of sense to me in terms of mitigation measures and pollution reduction measures. But in terms of like identifying data gaps and monitoring and evaluation, I'm not 100% sure that that's still the right framework. And some of it may be, certainly there may be recommendations around requirements around program evaluation or data tracking that the council and the state of Vermont need to be able to do some of this assessment that is data that's not currently tracked by service providers, for instance. Anyway, I'm sorry that I'm not providing any answers there, but I do hope that framing is helpful in that I just want to relieve, help us just yes, focus on what we can in the near term, because I hear you, TJ and Julie, that December 1 is looking us right in the eye 3 months away. But at the same time, I also want to encourage us that doesn't mean that if we can't get it done before then, we can't identify it for further work after that plan is done, because the council is going to, and this subcommittee is going to continue to exist, and there will be value to that work in terms of, updates, revisions that we can suggest to the plan that we submit or to future plans,
But Jared, I'd just like to second what you said there. This is my intention in flagging sort of the capacity concerns was not a no, never, nor was it a reflection that this isn't something we absolutely need to do. It's just a question of sort of how much energy to direct into this space, frankly, between now and December 1st, as opposed to putting it on the to-do list for once we have adopted that initial plan.
So thank you again, Leslie Ann and the task groups for pulling something together for the subcommittee to react to. Do we, as a subcommittee, I think there is now a little bit of structure around what these task groups or this two-headed task group, maybe two-parted task group is moving towards. But one, I just want to make sure and see if the committee is clear on what the direction is, or just really what the next steps are, or if the task group itself is clear on what the next steps are going forward. And if there's, I want to make sure the subcommittee is giving the right direction to the task group, essentially. So I want to open the floor to that general question for a minute.
And I think that question may be better posed like a week from now, because there isn't enough there to actually have anything to respond to concretely in a clear way. So that question, if I may say so, might be a little bit premature. And so I think it might be worth having the task group actually have a chance to debrief and work through some stuff before posing that. Because the answer you get today will be different than if there had been more chance and more space to actually do more stuff, right? So I see Jared shaking his head. Looks like he agrees with that.
I agree as well.
Okay, so that makes sense. So in that case, do you feel that the task group will be able to meet again and provide something for review, say Monday before Wednesday? Well, Monday's a holiday.
You mean Labor Day?
Yeah.
Would that be the one?
Yeah, you could do it Sunday if you want, Leslie Ann. That's fine. No, we'll just say before the next meeting.
Yeah, I will get folks together. I think part of the challenge has been, stuff on the ground, like Chris really not being able to do stuff because like dealing with flooding in his place. So yeah, so part of that stuff that life happens. So we'll pull something together.
Great. Any other subcommittee comments on these two issues?
Can I make one other request? Now that I've actually worked through it here, that switch from running from class to this didn't go as smoothly as I was hoping it would have gone. So we can talk offline about that.
Yeah, we did discuss at the top of the meeting that we'll be sending out a poll for new meeting times, and I'll provide some direction on the poll, but just to see if what the best time for folks can be for meetings going forward, because recognizing that there's multiple people that have recurring conflicts now, and so we need to make sure we can do the most for the most. And so folks will see a poll coming out probably later today.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for raising that again. All right. Hearing no other subcommittee. Oh, Jared, you have your hand up.
I have a question that is not on these two topics. So if there is anyone else who wants to speak about what we've just been speaking about, I don't want to. Okay, it doesn't look like there is. So I just want to say, now that we have presented the 2-page greenhouse gas inventory and supplemental accounting recommendations, and that will be forwarded to the council, and we'll prepare a presentation for the full council on September 14th. As I start thinking ahead on next steps on that, one of the things that I'm realizing is that it would be helpful. I don't mean to put you, Jane, on the spot, and if you don't have an answer to this now, that's fine. But since that first page does reference that, these are really recommendations about the existing in-boundary inventory, focused on gross emissions, and then we talk about upstream and life cycle emissions, and we do note in that first page that the carbon budget and the questions of net emissions, including carbon sinks, is the focus of another task. I could imagine people, having questions about where that stands, what that process is. And I just wonder if there's an update now about that, because I imagine that could come up in the broader context of, talking about emissions tracking.
Sorry, I like tuned out for 1 second. I think I missed the crux, which was around the years that we're setting. Is that what you were bringing up, Jared? Sorry.
No, sorry. I was asking the question about if you have a brief update now on where task 2 around the carbon budget stands, because I imagine that would be a natural question that would come up when we present on the emissions inventory and supplemental accounting recommendations.
Yes. We had a really productive meeting on really diving into the methodology around that about 2 weeks ago now with that task group. Probably right before I went on vacation, so actually more like 3 weeks ago. There were some lingering questions still around methodology, around agricultural components that I know they were going to follow up specifically with the ag agency on, and I probably need to do my part of ensuring everybody's feeling settled on that. But that deadline for the final carbon budget is to be delivered by the end of September. So I imagine we'll have a draft in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay, great. So if questions come up about that when I present on the GHG recommendations, I'll just turn it over to you, to Jane, to give that update.
And I'll pay attention that time so I can actually answer the question. Thank you.
And I guess I am kind of curious, given the interrelation between task 1 and task 2, a lot of us who've been focused on task 1 didn't have the bandwidth to focus on task 2. Myself, and I believe Colin hasn't been involved in that, but to the extent that they're interrelated questions, if there are drafts that get circulated or documents that could help us come up to speed, I for one would appreciate seeing those, and maybe Richard and Colin, now that we've moved on from task 1, I don't know if there are others who I just want to be able to be more informed on that, because I realize they're connected questions, not totally separate.
Yeah, there was a great presentation on it to Ag and Eco that I'll drop a link in the chat that goes into the methodology.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is one part in the LEAP modeling that actually is not part of the comprehensive energy plan modeling per se, although we have made some general assumptions in coordination with the Ag Subcommittee on a business as usual kind of reflection of sequestration. And so it's in the model structure, I should say, but it in order to show what things look like towards that net zero 2050 goal, that will show up in the modeling, kind of the sequestration and other pieces of the carbon budget. There other subcommittee discussion items before we head to public comment. I do want to take a second to just, I think, reflect on next steps. The main agenda item, I think, would be pursuing for our next meeting would be pursuing the items that Leslie Ann is working on, are working on, in terms of the climate modeling and that front matter of the plan, and then also the monitoring and assessment. Am I missing an agenda item for next week? Okay, okay, great. So with that, I guess I would like to open the floor to see if there's any other public comment on the issues we've discussed in the second half of the meeting today. I am not seeing any. So I guess I want to again thank Leslie Ann and the team for putting together the document to lead the discussion today. Jared, thank you again and Richard, Colin, and others that have been working on the greenhouse gas inventory, making really good progress there. And Brian for taking notes today. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody in the thank yous, and I missed the public input. George and Dave, appreciate your comments as well. And if there's nothing else, I think thank you, Jared, for co-chairing as always, and we can adjourn for today.
Well, and thank you, TJ.
Thanks, Brian.
If it's going around, man.
Yeah.
Did a heck of a job. Keep it up.
Yeah, thanks, TJ, for leading the facilitation.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I'm very glad that made it on the recording to the end. So thanks, Brian. Enjoy it. Well, see you all next week.